This is Came in Peace for All Mankind. That turns out to be the motto, and I'll show it to you a little later, that's on a plaque that's still on the moon on Apollo 11. And the picture here is of the LEM, the lunar module, as is in the configuration to land on the moon. This shows a picture of the lunar module sitting on the moon. And I want to point out a couple of things. One of the things we didn't know was how deep the soil was on the moon or what it was made out of. And we had been told that when we landed on the moon, we were going to end up in a pile of dust or disappear into a pile of dust, so we really didn't know. So we built that landing gear pad as big as we possibly could. This thing is not very glamorous looking. It's built strictly to operate in space. And there are a couple of changes that were made. This hatch here, and I'll show you a picture of it later, was originally a docking tunnel. Originally, where these windows are, it looked more like a helicopter, the way you look out of a helicopter. The lunar module performed flawlessly on all of its missions, and the question is why? And that question has puzzled me for years. But I think there are some really good reasons. One is President Kennedy stated a clear goal with a clear schedule, without any ambiguity about it. The mission mode was simple, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The mission mode was simple and it was efficient. The management structure was strong, it was authoritative, but it was also small. It was not a big bureaucracy. This is kind of the philosophy of the program. Better is the enemy of the good. Some people say it was a Russian who made that statement. I prefer to think it was Voltaire, but better is the enemy of the good. That was the philosophy of Dr. Shea, who was the program manager. And what that meant was, don't keep designing things and changing it. If it works, you test it, leave it alone. Use a simple design with built-in redundancy. That is, rather than trying to build complicated systems, build in redundancy. Ensure extensive testing of the flight hardware and the flight vehicles. Stress hardware reliability. Evaluate all failures and take corrective action. That may not sound like much, but that's really important. If you have a switch that fails, find out why it's shorted out. Don't just say, oh well, doesn't make any difference. And Dr. Lowe, who took over after Dr. Shea left, had another bit of philosophy which he carried for the rest of the program, and that is, any change is undesirable once you verify the design. Don't go around changing things. The Space Task Group was formed in 1958, and it was set up, well, I'll step back a minute. Formed in 1958, Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet fighter pilot, first man to orbit the Earth in April of 1961. A month later, President Kennedy issued his famous challenge to Congress. I believe that this nation should commit to achieving the goal before the decade's out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. That's a pretty simple goal. Hard to accomplish, but at least we knew what we were doing. Initially, there were three considerations, and I'll discuss this in some detail. Direct ascent, in other words, go directly from the Earth to the moon. The other was the Earth orbit rendezvous, where you assemble a spacecraft in Earth orbit and then go on to the moon. and then a direct ascent back to the Earth. The lunar orbit rendezvous, this was a very controversial idea. It scared a lot of people for good reasons. Turned out to be the one we used, and I'll go through that in a little detail. This is the plaque that is still on the lunar surface on LEM 11. It's on the ladder, and I remember carrying that plaque from at that time, Dr. Lowe's office, out to an astronaut who flew it down to the Cape about 2 or 3 days before liftoff. So that was a rather exciting experience. Here are some ideas of direct ascent. One, Jules Verne was what his idea was. Take a cannon, aim it at the moon, and shoot the bullet. Well, it turns out we didn't quite do it that way, but the size, the materials, the crew, everything about that story is what the LEM turned out to be, the command and service module, actually. Here's a picture of an early direct model that we had. Here's another, which was the Space Task Group favorite, and that's direct ascent. You can see it's really a very big vehicle. It's also very unstable if you don't land it perfectly. And I have a picture up here to give you an idea how the design considerations. This picture here is the direct ascent, which was the favored to begin with. The second one is the Earth orbit rendezvous, which is the idea that Dr. von Braun was pushing. And the reason that he wanted the Earth orbit rendezvous was because the C5 was not big enough for a direct ascent to the moon. To do that, we'd have to go to something called the Nova. This is the Nova here, which was never built. At the time that the decision was made, we were working on the C5, and these engines here were being developed. Prior to that, the C1, which was the first rocket that von Braun built in the U.S. Well, I guess he actually took versions of the V2 and developed those before that. In any event, this is what was used to go to the moon. Dr. von Braun was a very interesting guy. He built the V2 for the Germans. Brought his whole group over here. They settled at Huntsville at Marshall Space Flight Center. And he was probably the, I guess, driving force behind the whole thing. I remember going to a meeting with Dr. von Braun, and it was like a picture out of a James Bond movie. The room was dark. The only light was a little light in front of everybody. Everybody was dressed in black, and there wasn't a sound. Nobody was talking. And then when they finally got started on the meeting, wasn't any chit-chat. It was all business, and it was quite, I don't even remember the topic, I just remember the scene. This is the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. A maverick by the name of John Hobel is the one who came up with this. And everybody fought it until the very last minute. But basically what it amounted to was you lift it off using the C5, then you injected it into translunar trajectory going toward the moon. You had to retract the lunar module from the booster, and that's what this is. You braked in the lunar orbit. That's where we are up here. You Then you descended to the moon, which is where we are right here. I'm sorry, right here is where the ascent and descent stage started down to the moon. Made the lunar landing with the ascent and descent stage, and then you had to make a lunar orbit rendezvous to meet back up with the command and service module in lunar orbit. And that was just one part of this. I'll take it apart here so you can see it. It was just one part of this whole spacecraft. This lifted off from the lunar surface, leaving the descent stage on the lunar surface. This rendezvoused with the command and service module and then came back to Earth, leaving the ascent stage in lunar orbit and the descent stage on the lunar surface. Here, and I won't spend a lot, here's Volvo with his standing in front of his blackboard. We really used to use blackboards and write equations on them. It doesn't seem to be done much anymore. These are the three kind of simple diagrams. This is a direct, this is the Earth orbit, and this is the lunar orbit rendezvous. This is showing the translunar injection where the spacecraft is on its way to the moon. This is Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11 going down to the lunar surface. This is the ascent stage liftoff that I just talked about, where the ascent stage lifts off from the descent stage. Now, what to me is kind of amazing about this, at Kennedy Space Center, in order to launch a rocket, you use thousands of people. This used 2 people. And of course, they had a lot of help from mission control, but it was pretty kind of amazing. And then this is the ascent stage approaching the command module, getting ready to dock, and then they'll leave the ascent stage in lunar orbit and return to Earth. The management structure, which I think had a lot to do with the success. The Space Task Group was formed in 59, 58, through 62, although the Space Task Group really was never disbanded, but they were primarily working on the Mercury and Gemini program, and they came up with the basic requirements for the Apollo program. Dr. Shea took over at the program office in 1963 until the Apollo fire. He managed the total Apollo space program, configuration control, and another thing that he did, which really made a big difference, was he established the subsystem manager system. NASA had an engineering and development directorate, but they were kind of all working on different things. So he had Max Fauger assign a subsystem manager for each subsystem, like propulsion, electronics, radar, whatever. So we had a go-to guy for any problem we had. He encouraged teamwork at all levels. In other words, these guys could go all the way up here to talk. The people up here go all the way down at the bottom. There was really no hierarchy. And there's another concept that I think we've really lost track of. We seem to think now that we have to check everything and everybody does. And, you know, it's the big brother attitude. But that didn't exist in Apollo. What the philosophy was is the individual had to feel the responsibility for quality work. You couldn't inspect quality in, you had to build it in. And it took personal responsibility. The systems engineering, or the engineering, this would be the space task group. Subsystem engineering was, or systems engineering was done in the program office. That's where you have activity between subsystems, like, like the mission or the landing, where you had to worry about the landing gear and the weight of the vehicle and that sort of thing. Subsystems engineering, which is what I just talked about, was where the individuals were responsible. This was one of the major early challenges we had. The proposal from Grumman Aircraft proposed doing a ascent-descent stage separation test. That's where the ascent stage separates from the descent stage. Well, you can't do that on the Earth because we don't have a vacuum chamber big enough to duplicate the deep space conditions. So one of the ideas, the early ideas, was to take a rocket that we had developed to check out the escape mechanism, had a launch escape system, and to put a bulb on the end of it and stick a limb inside it and fire it up, to a no sensible atmosphere. Well, we found out, running wind tunnel tests, number one, that configuration was unstable. It would only go to 50,000 feet, which is not high enough. You have to go to at least 200,000. So what we ended up doing was putting the LEM 1, which was the only unmanned vehicle we flew, on top of an S-1C booster in a spacecraft adapter and sticking the LEM inside, and then it opened up like a flower, really, and the LEM then fired up the descent engine and did this mission unmanned in Earth orbit. And that decision was made in the Apollo spacecraft program office. This is another problem. This is really a systems problem. We had a number of challenges, but these are just a few of them. How many legs does it take? We argued about that. Some people thought 3. Some said no, 5. We ended up with 4. The other issue was whether they were folded or fixed landing gear. If it was fixed, then the spread between the gears was not enough to assure that the CG of the vehicle always stayed behind the gear, which is really a critical point to keep it from tipping over. We had no idea, well, we had a very vague idea of what the lunar surface was like, but we were absolutely wrong. But anyway, this particular problem had a low schedule risk in that we had plenty of time to make the landing gear, but if we were wrong and we disappeared in that pile of dust, it was kind of a bad day. So the decision was to go with four legs. They were folding, just fold it up under the vehicle like that. I mentioned the lunar surface, and we went to a 3-foot pad diameter, which was the biggest that we could, the biggest pad we could put. I remember going to a meeting with Dr. Lee, subsystem manager, and trying to decide what drawings to release, and we just said, make it as big as you can. Well, that is the pad, because we didn't know how big. So that's how the 3 feet came up. That was as big as we could make. Not a very scientific way to do things. In the manufacturing and spacecraft checkout and test, we had all kinds of problems, and I'm not even going to talk about most of them, just a couple. This shows the ascent stage, the way it was put together, the descent stage, the way it was put together. It was a cruciform structure with the tank sitting in here. It had, in order to save weight, we had to take the equivalent, I don't know if you can see this or not, probably can't. We had to take weight out of the LEM, the equivalent to a Chevrolet, about 3,000 pounds. We had about, I don't know how many, we had 200, we took out 200 pounds, so we had many miles of this number 26 gauge wire, which broke very easily. The connectors were hard to attach. It was a real problem. It cost us a lot of time. Anyway, that's the reason why I have these blue lines in here, is just to show the wiring. This, and I know that you've seen pictures like this, this is what we call the automatic checkout station, and we use these at the factory to check out the lunar module. It was also used out in California and used down at the Cape. You notice that it looks like mission control. Well, whether mission control design came from this, or I'm not sure, but in any event, it's quite similar to the layout. Early in the program, Grumman had strongly underestimated the cost and schedule for the ground support equipment. There was an awful lot of it. The ground support equipment had a high schedule risk because if you didn't get it built, you couldn't check the vehicle out. But on the other hand, it really didn't have a high mission risk because you could take the time and, stumble through it somehow. This gives you an idea of all the equipment, all the cables and support equipment. This was the full-size LEM sitting here with all of its support equipment around it. Now we don't have that problem, and all these cables, to be digital, but then we had both digital and analog. So that ACE station had to handle 2 kinds of signals, and there were several thousand of them. Okay, what's the summary of the major challenges and decisions? The challenges I talked about were landing the man on the moon and returning. That was accomplished in 1969. It was accomplished using the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. Originally, and I didn't really discuss this, originally we had 2 docking modes on the lunar module. One was in the front. Let me see if I can go back to it. Yes, here it is. The original concept was to have this docking tunnel. We had a docking tunnel here and a docking tunnel at the top. The original concept was you could either dock in the front or dock at the top when you came back from the lunar surface. The reason for that is the idea of redundancy, but it had a number of problems with it. Number one, it was quite heavy. it had a tendency to obstruct the view of the crew when they were landing. And also the way it was configured, you had to build this cockpit like it was like a helicopter, so you could see, I think it's something like 130 degrees you have to be able to see. In any event, that was the original idea. So what we decided to do was to eliminate this tunnel here, put in a hatch, which doesn't show up. The crew had trouble in some of the tests we ran exiting through this tunnel to get out to the lunar surface. So to get this, leaving that tunnel off also solved that problem. It gave us a big hatch so they could crawl out easily. We would use the top tunnel for docking. So then the question, what happens if for some reason something jams when you try to latch those two vehicles together? So what we had as a backup mode, a redundant mode, was a spacewalk, where you get the spacecrafts close to one another and then use an EVA or extravehicular activity to get the crew back into the command module, and then you could return. I want to talk for just a minute, too, about Dr. Lanscombe. I was asked to go to work for Dr. Lanscombe quite early in the lunar program. And he was German. He'd been brought in to solve the ground support equipment problem and design the A station. And we went up to Bethpage, we went into the first meeting that I really had with Grumman. And I'm sure that you all have had a client or a contractor client relationship where, especially with the government, what the contractor wants to do is bring you in, feed you, have you take up as little of their time as possible, and then get you back on the airplane. That's basically the way it works in aerospace. Well, they tried that with Dr. Lanscombe. So a fellow by the name of Dick Spinner started out, we call it here at the MLS, housekeeping. He started out with his housekeeping. And he started out by saying, we will start our meetings at 9 o'clock. This happened to be 8 o'clock, but in the future we'll start our meetings at 9 o'clock. We'll have a coffee break from 10 to 10:30. We will break for lunch, go to the executive dining room at 12. We'll return at 1. We'll have a coffee break at 2:30 and come back, start the meeting up at 3. Well, Dr. Lanscombe reached down into his briefcase. He always had carried this government briefcase. And he set an apple and a soda in front of him on the desk. And he said, Mr. Spinner, we will not have a coffee break at 10:30. We will not break for lunch. 12. We will work through lunch. The apple and soda is my lunch. We will not break for coffee in the afternoon. We will not quit at 5. We will stay until we're through. Silence. I mean, I don't think they'd ever been quite treated like that before. But in any event, it worked out quite well, because after a while, it was a little rough at the beginning, because people had to learn that we weren't there to have coffee and visit. We're there to try to accomplish something. In any event, the ground support equipment support of the program got back on schedule, and Dr. Lansgrund was quite a character. He wore a black suit, he had slick down hair. I almost hate to say this, but to get a picture of kind of what he was like is Dr. Strangelove. Okay. The ascent descent separation, we've talked about that. We used the S1C. Ground support equipment, I just got through with that. But there is one additional thing we did. The program was really in pretty bad shape. It was way over cost, way behind schedule. So that responsibility was moved back to the Manned Spacecraft Center. Weight increase, I mentioned that. We had to take out about 3,000 pounds. The subsystem managers were given a weight target, and they were allowed $10,000 a pound to remove weight from the system. So at that time, that seems like a huge amount of money. Now it's, buys you a cup of coffee or something. Manufacturing and checkout had some very serious schedule problems, and one of them was that wiring. I think that was the biggest, but there were other things. There were qual failures. We'd run a test on a landing radar. Seemed to be okay, but then the radar would fail while it was being qualified at the vendor. So then we'd have to take it out, replace it, put a new one in. And it just, things like that were going on constantly. We also have a lot of procedural problems. Grumman was an aircraft company, and they weren't quite used to the NASA way of doing procedures, which is really pretty detailed, I guess, best way to describe it. So we had some real problems. I remember going to the A station, and there'd be the test conductor would be answering telephone calls. He'd be calling out to a test engineer. Your wife is on the phone. Just all kinds of interruptions. So probably they were doing about 15 minutes of testing for every hour they were in there. The other thing that they did, which was, I think, the major problem, was for lunch, and they were over 24 hours a day, at night especially, when they placed to eat close by. So what they do, they break for lunch, everybody take off, one or two people, so it'd be an hour, one or two people could be 15, 20, half hour late. And that happened, everybody would stop. Couldn't do anything. So you just, every day, you lose an hour, hour and a half for each shift just taking lunch breaks. So I talked to, as a matter of fact, I talked to the president of the company. He said, you know what you ought to do? You've got one of the best delicatessens in the country up here in New York. Why don't you have them cater sandwiches and soft drinks and coffee right next to the A station, and we have room to do that. And just give the people their lunch. And then we'll make sure they'll get back and take a break when it's convenient, and make sure that they continue testing and not stop all the time. Well, that worked. The other thing we did was we had the Kennedy people who had worked on the Mercury Gemini program station sitting right next to the Grumman test engineers, so they could learn to work together. And then the vehicle was finally shipped to Cape. They also would know the vehicle and the Kennedy people. So that worked pretty well. On 27th of January 1967, I don't really remember this, we had a fire over the screeching cold. Nobody, of course, everybody was really upset about it. What the world happened? How can this happen? You probably remember it was because we use 100% oxygen at about 16 psi, and there was a short somewhere in the command module, ignited some flammable material, flash fire, killed everybody. So the command module took considerable rework. I mean, they had some real serious problems. It turned out that the lunar module, from a fire standpoint, was really in pretty good shape. All we had to do were other things. We changed from pure oxygen to an atmosphere, regular, like the atmosphere, and went through and checked all the wiring and plugs and everything to make sure, took out all the flammable materials, make sure that couldn't happen again. And the other thing we were able to do, which was a real blessing really, was we were able to incorporate all those fixes in parallel with installing equipment and checking the vehicle out. So the truth of the matter is that we actually gained in the overall program, we actually gained some time, where the program was set back about a year, but we actually managed to gain some time. Okay, summary. LEM was delivered to Kennedy 23 June 1967. It was launched on S1C on 22nd of January 1968. It successfully tested the dynamics of separation. All objectives were met, but it was unmanned. Apollo 11 landed on the lunar surface on the 20th of July 1969. Apollo 13, which I know you've all heard about that. The lunar module acted as a lifeboat. The crew never got back without the lunar module. Because they were over halfway to the moon, they would have just flown right on by the moon and kept on going. But the lunar module acted really as a service module on the command and service module, and managed to slow the vehicle down, take it around the moon, and then accelerate it back toward Earth, and then slow it down for the entry and splashdown. But you've heard about all that. The program came to an end in December of 1970.